Hello, welcome to Analyse This, Mental Health in Film and TV. I'm your host, Dr. Boo, clinical psychologist. Each week, myself and a guest take a look at a film or series and consider the way mental health, neurodiversity and therapy are portrayed. In this episode, we look at the highest grossing film of 1988, Rainman.
Of course, I'm an excellent driver.
You know how to drive?
Yeah.
When did you drive?
Of course, I drove the Buick on the driveway when my dad came to Walbrook.
Was Dad in the car? Was Dad in the car, right?
Yeah.
And he let you drive the Buick?
Yeah, slow on the driveway.
Well, we'll have to let you drive sometime. Rainman! You never touch the steering wheel when I'm driving. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Of course, I don't have my underwear.
What?
I'm definitely not wearing my underwear.
What are you talking about? I gave you a fresh pair of mine this
No,
morning.
not my underwear.
The film was nominated for 8 Oscars, and Dustin Hoffman won Best Leading Actor for his portrayal of Raymond, a man with autism spectrum condition. Clinical psychologist Dr. Carol Stott, or Dr. Kaz, and I take a look at autism, touching on prevalence rates and diagnosis, and whether the portrayal of autism in Rainman is accurate. What does the film get right and get wrong? And we ask, did this film create a damaging stereotype or increase awareness of autism? I'm here today with Dr. Carol Stott, or Dr. Kaz, as we're going to call her, for the purposes of this podcast. And Dr. Kaz is a clinical psychologist, eminent in the field of autism, and co-director of Beginning with A. And I met you, Dr. Kaz, when we were doing autism training. So you trained me in how to use the ADOS, which is one of the, many moons ago. So I used to work with people with autism and learning disabilities within the National Health Service, and then went on to work in private practice with people with autism spectrum disorders, looking at things like diagnosis. Yep. So that's how we met.
It is
in Newmarket, if I remember rightly, in the race course.
Yes, at the British Racing School.
Yes, which was great because you got to see the horses during the breaks.
Yeah, interesting venue, wasn't it? Interesting venue.
It was good, and also really good cookies, if I remember rightly.
Absolutely, and not been seen for a while, really, since 14 months ago, I suppose. All of our courses have been online, so we haven't been in venues like it since then, I guess, really.
And that must be really different, doing this kind of training online, something which none of us have ever had to do before. You've been doing sort of autism assessments, and I know that Beginning with A does both the training and the assessments and so forth. How long have you been doing this sort of work for?
In this way, I guess, with the training being a bigger part of what I do, for actually it's sort of frightening about 10 years, something like that now. Longer than I would imagine it is if I don't really think about it. But yeah, I've been doing the work in the field for much longer than that. But it's only the last 10 years or so that we developed Beginning with A, and then we started working. I work with my partner, Gary. His background is in databases, IT sort of things. So we've kind of combined our skill sets in a sense. And we did that prior to the online courses as well. So he was helping with course materials and these kind of things. That, the last 10 years or so. And in a sense, that's now kind of made things a bit more balanced between clinical work and training. Prior to that, I was doing more academic stuff with some clinical work. So my clinical work has maintained itself at that kind of level, really, at 50% or so of what I do. Previously, the remainder was academic stuff, research and so on. And now it's training.
Okay. And why autism? What's led you to have this particular interest?
I guess initially as a child psychologist more broadly, the research that I was doing in Cambridge was in Simon Baron-Cohen's lab, but not with Simon initially. So I was working with a number of people on a project about specific language impairment, as it was then referred to as, and the prevalence. So it was kind of epidemiological approaches, I suppose, to child development and developmental disorders. So that was what then led to my PhD, which was in specific language impairment. epidemiology of. And in the middle of all of that, Simon Baron-Cohen arrived from, I think he came to us from King's London, or anyway, London somewhere, Institute of Psychiatry, in fact, to our department. And of course, all things autism then began to be more evident in our department. So Simon was my internal examiner for my PhD. So through that time, I was becoming more and more aware of autism specifically, rather than the specific language impairment focus that I previously had. So that, I guess. I then was part of a prevalence study that was happening in Cambridge, and I was developing my clinical work with a greater kind of focus on autism than just language impairment. So that's the history of it. And then training, yeah.
And how long are we talking? So at what point were you looking at those prevalence studies?
Well, the children that were in the prevalence study, the specific language impairment study, were born in 1989, so I can date it from that. I started working with them on that study when they were 6, and the intention was to follow them through. They're now in their 30s, near enough, won't they be? And it was about 8 years or so after the beginning of that. So we're thinking mid-90s, I suppose, where I started working more with children with autism, children and adults with autism. And the prevalence study, it began then. It was published a long time later, because it took quite a long time for us to actually do it, and then believe the results, really, because the prevalence seemed to be kind of rising hugely at that time. So we were very careful about what we were able to publish, really, at that time.
Excellent. So we're talking today about autism and autism spectrum disorders, or ASD. And I think that it's very easy, because Dr. Kaz and I are very familiar with ASD, for us to start talking as if it's something which there's a global understanding of, which I don't think is necessarily the case. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kaz to just give us a very quick sort of couple of minutes of explaining what is ASD.
Okay, and even that's harder than it perhaps sounds. I just often wonder whether ASD is a thing, and it's something I think that there's lots of discussions around, that there isn't particularly one autism. There's almost like several autisms. So I guess what we're thinking about with that question is what actually brings all of those autisms together. What do these various presentations mean that a person with autism is likely to have in common with another person with autism? And the fundamental things are difficulties with social understanding and social communication, difficulties with perhaps unusual behaviours. It's difficult to talk about this particular bit because there are so many of them, but sensory processing issues, sensory processing difficulties, unusual interest in things for various reasons, really, that come together in the unusual intensity of the interest, motor stereotypies, stereotyped behaviours. All of these things that I've just said kind of come together in one additional set of behaviours and set of difficulties that people often have, and together with the social communication and social understanding sometimes being a little different, a lot more than just sociable. So it's not being sociable, it's quite often about not understanding what someone else might be thinking, what someone else's expectations are, and social cognition, a huge part of that. So I've probably made it sound complicated again, but essentially social communication and some unusual behaviours that may well derive from sensory discomfort, and finding ways in which to feel more comfortable. That makes sense?
It does, yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I guess the other thing we should say is the strengths that come with autism as well. There are lots of things that I find it frustrating, and I guess you're in the same kind of position, really. But because of what we're doing, we're almost forced into thinking, certainly when diagnosing somebody with autism, when carrying out a diagnostic assessment, we're on the lookout for things that are difficult. And so we automatically launch ourselves fairly quickly into that language of difficulty, when of course there are many aspects of autism which bring tremendous strengths to people. And it's the sort of situation where you absolutely need to emphasize those things, but it's not what comes naturally for somebody to do when you're assessing someone for a set of difficulties. And that I find a quite difficult dilemma sometimes. In summary, it's not. Afterwards, it's not. Afterwards we can talk, of course, to people about the strengths that they have and the way that they can be used. But it's the process of identifying what means that someone meets criteria for a diagnosis are all about the difficulties, not about the strengths.
So I think what I'll do is do a quick kind of 30, 45 seconds of what Rainman was about for anybody out there who hasn't watched it, which I think is a little bit unlikely. It's such...
Yes, that's
yeah,
it feels a little bit, and you wonder a little bit whether that's our own interest or whether it really, it feels like people know about Rainman.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it feels a little dated, and I was expecting it to feel more dated, I think, perhaps than it did, but we'll definitely come on to that as well. So the film basically starts with this self-centered hustler, Charlie Babbitt. He finds that his estranged father has died, discovers he's got an older brother, Raymond, who he's never known about in his memory. He presents he's presented to us at first as an institutionalized autistic savant who's inherited all of their father's $3 million fortune. Charlie has inherited little more than a 1949 Buick Roadmaster convertible. He kidnaps Raymond. The pair embark on this road trip. Charlie realizes Raymond has potential to make money, basically, and he shows he's good at maths and he can count toothpicks. There's a leap that's made between counting toothpicks and potential at counting cards. They then have a lovely time. Charlie sees Raymond has dimensions that he was unaware of, starts to actually like him, and then eventually realizes actually he's still better off back at home in the institution where he originally found him, but they then have this different kind of relationship. So that's the film in a nutshell for anybody who's forgotten what it's about. And I think it's interesting to start, perhaps, given how we both know each other, to sort of break down Raymond's character and how he's actually portrayed as somebody who has an autism spectrum disorder, and thinking about what we know of the history of the film, because actually it seems to me that my understanding is that that character was never meant to be autistic. He was meant to be savant, but not necessarily autistic, and the autistic characteristics came along later. I think it would be interesting to think about how that's portrayed. What would we notice about him? What would we look out for if he was in your clinic, Dr. Kaz? What would you see?
Okay.
And is it accurate? That's the important thing.
I think that's a really interesting question, because my recollection of Rainman, because I'd seen it before I really knew terribly much about autism, I perhaps knew a little bit more than maybe a lay member of the population or whatever, simply because of having worked in child development and so on. But I didn't really know a lot about autism. And watching Rainman then, I guess I was in a very similar position to many other people. It was telling us that this is what autism kind of is. Albeit when I watched it again more recently, it reminded me that they're fairly clear at the beginning that this is an autistic savant. This isn't necessarily intending to portray autism as we now understand it to be. But nonetheless, whatever their intentions were, I think then that Rainman became autism. That for that period of time, that's what autism was. Now, over time, I think, again, almost in a popular sort of way when we talk about it, I think many of us have come to understand and to say that Rainman doesn't represent autism well. So in a sense, until I watched it again recently, I'd forgotten how well it actually does represent the autistic savant. It represents the autistic savant brilliantly, but that's not saying that it represents autism. And that was one of the biggest sort of, yes moments, I think somebody like that in my clinic would be extremely rare. What I was looking up just today, I watched it again really recently, and what I was looking at today was prevalence of savantism, and there's various estimates, obviously, as there would be, but it's surprisingly high, and I don't quite believe that. It's one thing that I read today, and I don't know the provenance of it academically really, but what it's saying is that it's between 1 in 10 and 1 in 100 people with autism are savants. That I find stunning. I can't imagine that is a recent figure. So we need to look a bit more at that, I reckon.
The statistic I found was while obviously savant syndrome co-occurs with a range of developmental conditions, but most cases seem to be autism.
Yes.
And it was up to 37% of autistic individuals.
Wow.
And I was thinking, that
No.
is incredibly high. In my knowledge of people with ASD, yes, especially I was working with people who have learning disabilities for most of my career. And I think you will often find people who have got areas that they excel in comparison to their other skills. But
Yes.
that is not the same as being
Not
a
the
savant.
same thing. Exactly. And one of the notes that I made when I'm thinking this through was that what it actually said in this rough and ready prevalence estimate that I read was that it didn't say traits quite, but it said features of savantism. Now, I can actually understand that and think, if I relate back to the people in my clinic, very, very often I find that if for whatever reason we look at cognitive ability, which I often do as part of the diagnostic process, then it's almost always the case that the person has a very discrepant IQ profile. So much more likely for that to be the case, certainly in my own experience, and I think the literature supports it, that there's a much bigger prevalence of really discrepant IQ profiles. And it isn't as we'd always thought it to be, I don't think. It's not that it's always one way. It's not that people have either higher verbal skills or non-verbal skills even. It's within each of those sets of abilities that there are very different expectations, really. And that isn't really savant. It's certainly not what's represented by Rainman, because he has spectacularly high skills, in numeracy is mostly in fact finding and recall of facts and things like that. So it is a step above what I'm talking about, I guess, in my clinic. I'd be stunned if I saw someone like Rainman in my clinic. I'd be like, wow, that is really unusual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of this is because he was based, I think, to large extent on Kim Peek, who was considered a mega savant.
Yes.
And he could speed through a book in about an hour and remember most of what he read. And I think that Dustin Hoffman uses a similar kind of approach when he reads, because what Kim Peek used to do was he would scan the left page with his left eye and read the right page with his right eye.
Really?
Absolutely incredible. And he would also, so he had his bookshelves, and when he'd read a book, he would turn it upside down. So that's another one that I've read. And I think that, again, I think we saw some mirroring of that when Charlie's messing with the bookshelves. And, well, obviously also because they are Raymond's bookshelves and he doesn't want to be touched. But he also would memorize lots of information in lots and lots of subjects and music and dates and things like that. So I think a lot of the aspects of the performance were sort of based on him. But he didn't have autism. He had FG syndrome. So
okay.
It's interesting that I think that you could see where they were going, and then they sort of pulled autism into it. I think he also studied Temple Grandin.
Okay.
And I think that that's a name that several people listening will know. At least one or two of our 2 or 3 listeners will be aware of Temple Grandin. And I think that maybe that's the other thing, is that we know the people who have autism and are savants more than we know people who just have autism generally, because those are the ones who are in the public eye. So people like Stephen Wiltshire and Temple Grandin and people like that, who I think astonish the general population with their abilities and possibly then perpetuate this idea that actually autism and being a savant are things that go hand in hand, which is, as you and I say, that's just not our experience clinically.
But I think a lot of the things that I was pleasantly surprised and reminded about when I watched it recently was the accuracy of the inaccuracy in a sense of the whole picture, but the accuracy of each of the traits that it was portraying as being characteristic. So there were lots of things like when you mentioned about the books, and of course it's Raymond's room and he wouldn't want people messing with his books, but his response to that was quite classically autistic-like. And, the various things that he did, the meltdowns that he had, the putting his hands to his ears when the noise was disturbing. And it was almost like lots and lots and lots of these traits that are shown by some people with autism, but not all, and not all of them by one person, all arrived in Raymond's life. So, there's that dilemma about thinking, well, that wouldn't ever happen, that anybody would have all of those traits together. But there wasn't a single one of them at any point, I don't think, that I thought, oh, that's not portraying autism, that's not an autistic trait. They all were. Yeah. But they were all together.
Absolutely. And some of them were great. I particularly liked his I don't know, when he didn't want to pursue the conversation or couldn't cognitively comprehend what's being asked of him. The I don't know as a go-to phrase I thought was actually really brilliantly done. I really enjoyed watching him do that.
And the uh-oh. That's
and in the phone box. So the phone box is one of my favourite scenes, which apparently was somewhat improvised because they're standing in the phone box and Charlie Babbitt's trying to make a phone call and
with his backpack.
his backpack on, and he squeezed Raymond in with him because he doesn't want Raymond to sort of run off anywhere as he has a tendency to do. And then suddenly it goes a bit still and Raymond says, uh-oh, fart. And apparently this was because Dustin Hoffman did actually fart in the phone box.
Oh my goodness, wow.
Then they just improvised the rest of that scene, which I absolutely loved. I think that's a beautiful scene. One of the things, looking at those little individual presentations that he has, so he has the repetitive speech, there's definitely the kind of the rocking, the wringing hands, hand flapping and slapping and so forth. The sensory sensitivity side of things really intrigued me watching it, because he disliked being touched, which is, again, quite classic, but he actually dealt with very stimulating environments with very little problem a lot of the time. After a while, he finds a lot of noise difficult and he'll put his hands over his eyes or his ears if that happened. But actually, going into the casino, one of the first things I thought was, gosh, that actually, for somebody especially who'd been in this institution, which is very quiet and very calm and subdued, to suddenly be somewhere like the casino, I thought he coped remarkably well, and I wasn't sure that was particularly accurate.
So in a sense, I think some of the inaccuracies, if you like, are more to do with the absences of what you would expect rather than the presence of what there were. So the sorts of things that there were there and that were made evident were, like I said, really, there were so many of them, it was a bit unlikely that all of those traits would occur for one person. But yes, you're absolutely right. There were other things that didn't happen that perhaps would have done, and that occurred to me fairly soon on. The transition, he dealt with the transition hugely well.
Yes.
He had his individual little transitions, which he'd got to watch his program. It was time for dinner, and all of these things. Tuesday was whatever day it was for whatever. I think it was pepperoni or something. But all of these were his definite routines and his definite rituals often. But he didn't seem to bat an eyelid about having gone from an institution to be on the road, and
And the idea of that. Just that didn't sit with me at all. The idea that actually, so in theory, you could take somebody who has sort of autism to the extent that he does and put them on a holiday, but so long as you put their bed in the same place and they have the same meal, they'll be okay, which just, again, not actually that accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I also thought, and I wonder sometimes how this, I don't know, not portrayed, I don't quite mean how it should be portrayed, but my own response very often to people that I know and know well with autism is very often a humorous one, and it's very often a humorous, affectionate one. And I wonder sometimes, it just occurs to me sometimes on my training courses, if I'm speaking to people about people that I know, and not necessarily clients, not necessarily patients, friends, people that I know from outside of working clinically with them, and I'll share humorous anecdotes about them, and then I'm always a little bit kind of concerned, is this, and there's this big thing about laughing at people, laughing with people, and all of that, and I personally don't feel a discomfort about that, but it just raised that thought for me about people with autism and their response to it. I think it's intentionally humorous. And I think it's intentionally humorous when it portrays the characteristics that we all, I think, find appealing. I certainly find appealing. But there's a question mark then around whether that's a bit demeaning as well. And I don't know the answer to that, really, because I feel positive about it, but I don't know that every person with autism would actually,
Yeah.
So it did bring those kind of thoughts to me a bit as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that there are other things that are raised in terms of his abilities and his dignity.
Yeah.
He's definitely taken away completely against his will
Yeah.
and he's given no choices whatsoever, apart from the ones he actually demands. So it's almost as if the only things that Charlie will let him do are the things that he really has no choice but to let
Yes.
Raymond do. Otherwise, awful
Yeah.
things will happen.
That's right.
And it's interesting because you get that feeling of choices being made for somebody, especially somebody who has difficulty communicating generally what they want and what they need. And I think that was the problem I had watching the film. The discomfort I had watching it was watching somebody being sort of foisted back and forth. And I think that Charlie Babbitt's girlfriend in that was that voice that we all wanted to hear, which I thought was lovely.
Absolutely.
That this isn't fair, this isn't okay, you shouldn't be treating him like this.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really good that they managed to weave in a voice that spoke for Raymond when he couldn't speak for himself.
Yes, absolutely. And that I became particularly evident when she wasn't there. So she was there at the beginning, and then there was that whole period of time when she wasn't, and then she arrived again, and it really highlighted that. I think absolutely highlighted that.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought of as well was that relationship that builds between Raymond and the other characters, and the doctor from the institution that Raymond lives in originally has a line in the film where he says, "You may have a brother, but the truth is he's not capable of having a relationship with you." And I don't know whether that was a sign of the times, that actually there were people who would believe that of somebody who had ASD, that they wouldn't be able to have a relationship with somebody else, or whether actually, that's meant to be stark because actually he does have a relationship with his brother, and we can clearly see that he has a relationship that evolves and develops.
Yeah. Or also, what that line made me think about as well was whether he meant that he couldn't have the relationship that Charlie would demand, that Raymond could have the relationship. I don't know that he really meant all of this. This is just my head going a bit, but I did wonder about that, whether what he meant was he's not going to provide you with the relationship that you want from a brother, and maybe Charlie was then beginning to say, no, actually, perhaps he can, because we did all of these things. And I think in that final evaluation thing, which is particularly awful, but the final evaluation bit where Charlie seems to be coming in with the personable things that they did. They danced together and they did the things that brothers might do that were a bit fun and a bit silly and a bit kind of not what the whole thing had started off being about at all, and was almost portraying that side of Charlie, that I can have this relationship with another person. So it was almost about Charlie's personality and his losses over the years. That I think they attempted to bring that in, and whether they succeeded completely, I don't know. But yeah, I think they tried to.
One of the other things that struck with me, and we were talking before about sort of humour, there is a point in the film where, towards the end, where Charlie makes sure that there's maple syrup on the table before the pancakes arrive.
Yeah.
And Raymond's response to that, because he says, but of course there's no maple syrup, and Charlie says, aha, look, right here. And Raymond says, haha, Charlie Babbitt made a joke.
A joke. Yeah.
And unpicking that, though, from an ASD point of view, with everything else that we know about Raymond, I'm not convinced that he would have realised that was a joke.
No, I don't think he would have, and I don't think he would have near the end. As there were a couple of times at the end, weren't there, when he made a joke himself. It's when they're separating, isn't it? It's when he's going back to the shiny train, and he's got his suit on, and the suit's commented on, and Raymond said, well, Charlie says to him, say it, Raymond, and he says Kmart sucks. And it's just obviously rehearsed. And then he says, oh, Raymond made a joke. I don't think he had a clue that it was to do with the irony of Kmart being what he wanted at the very beginning, and now he's going to say Kmart sucks. It's because Charlie had told him to say it.
Exactly. And it's that echolalia. He has a lot of that throughout, just repeating what he's heard, and it makes him feel reassured to do that.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And a lot of that echolalic speech is slightly unusual as well, I think, because it gets a little bit muddled. And I don't know whether this is inaccurate necessarily, but it occurred to me at the time that I was listening to it, that it got mixed up with the absolute recall for detail, which is not quite the same thing as an echolalic characteristic. It wasn't just repeating something that somebody had happened to say. It was repeating something that somebody had happened to say in the most enormous detail. So he was repeating the Wheel of Fortune stuff at the beginning of the show, the whole thing, the whole script. Now, maybe that is what they wanted to portray. Maybe that's accurate, but it was mixed up with just the non-symbolic echolalia. That he didn't really portray that, I don't think.
And one of the things that he does with the echolalia and the repeated speech is my main man Vern, Vern, Vern. So when he's getting agitated and upset about something, he repeats that, and then towards the end he starts to use Charlie instead. My main man Charlie, Charlie, and it's ever so resonant, and it's very heartwarming. But again, I couldn't help but wonder, is that, putting my psychologist hat on, it's lovely and it's heartwarming and I love watching it, but is that actually accurate? Does that make sense from the point of view of somebody who has ASD suddenly switching and doing that after a week with this complete stranger who's actually ruined his routines?
That's the other thing, isn't it? When you get to the end of it and you remember that it's only a week, then that's stunning. Then you think, hang on a minute, all of this has happened in a week. Of course it wouldn't happen like that in a week. Now, okay, there's the license of it being a movie and everything else, but that at the end of it, and you know that when you're watching it, obviously, but by the end you've kind of forgotten that it's only a week until it comes up again. Back here we are, and we've been away a week. And where was Vern when they got back? Did I miss him?
Exactly.
Or was he just not there? He was his main man.
He was, and that upset. Actually, I watched this film with my 11-year-old. I watched most of the films that we talk about on here with my 11-year-old, whether I should or not. Doesn't matter, possibly. But he really enjoyed the film far more than he was expecting to.
Right. Okay.
But that was the thing that upset him the most, was that Raymond had been taken away from Vern.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting perspective, I guess. Again, my psychology hat on. The removal from an attachment figure as being the thing that is most triggering in a child, totally understandable. But I totally understood that as well. It's not fair. At the end of the day, whatever you think of the potential institutionalization of Raymond and whether or not that was in fact the case, he seems to be very happy and content with the life he had. He was removed from not only his room and his belongings, but the one person who he had a really close relationship with.
Yeah.
And also, though, one where Vern says he wouldn't notice if I left. And again, I thought, actually, I don't think that's true.
True.
I think he very much would notice if you left. I think that you are one of the parts of his world that anchors him and makes him feel reassured. So I think actually if Vern had left, I think that he would have really struggled a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. He'd been there 9 years, he'd said at the beginning.
Yes.
9 years. So, whoa. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I didn't realise until when I was watching it for the last time, just to remind myself for today, really, I watched it on my iPad. And so therefore I had all of the information bits and pieces that can be a bit irritating if you're intending just to watch a movie, but I was quite interested in looking at some of these things. I didn't know half of them, but one of the things that it said was that it was Dustin Hoffman who fought for the ending. And the screenwriter, directors and whoever else wanted the ending to be that he stayed with Charlie Babbitt. And it was Dustin Hoffman that said, no, that just is not in character. That just wouldn't happen, shouldn't happen. He needs to go back. And the character needs to go back. So I thought it was quite interesting, really, quite insightful.
It is, and I think probably demonstrates his understanding based on the amount that he immerses himself in a role.
Yeah.
So he's very much that sort of Stanislavskian method actor who not only did he follow people around and sort of live alongside people who had savant presentations or autism, but I think he actually also at one point, maybe even before his acting career, actually did work in a residential home or unit at one point. So I think that he really would know, and I'm glad that they did follow that, and also I'm glad that they took on the idea of having somebody who doesn't just have sort of a savant presentation but also has ASD. I'm glad that they added that dimension, because I think it was interesting, especially because this was the 1980s and I'm not entirely sure what the understanding was of autism in the 1980s. I do think that some of the things that we see in the film may be related to a misunderstanding that the filmmakers have, but also there's a definite showing that they didn't expect people to necessarily, even in medical fields, know what autism was. So when he goes to the GP's, when he goes to surgery, the nurse says he's autistic.
Yeah, what's
and
that?
I start thinking, oh, come on, she's a nurse, of course she would know what autism is, but actually maybe she wouldn't.
Maybe not.
And the GP says most autistics can't speak and can't communicate. And again, that's just not true.
Yeah.
And I didn't know whether that was a misunderstanding that was meant to be showing the misunderstanding of society, or whether it was a misunderstanding of the filmmakers. But either way, looking back with our sort of 2021 eyes, we can see that is just wrong. Most people who have autism can speak and can communicate.
Yeah, of course. And I wonder whether some of that is to do with the change in prevalence to some extent, and what all of the change in prevalence has been about is hugely contentious, and perhaps we don't go down there because there's all kind of reasons why, one for various either relating to more physiological things, relating to our better understanding, relating to our better services, whatever else. But I think there was a sense at that time that people with autism were more impaired than we now understand them to be. Whether or not that had been part of the difference in the number of people that were recognised as having autism, and so therefore their presentation was perhaps more obvious, and therefore those people would be noticed more, or not, I don't know. But I did think about that, because that certainly, I know that at the time, for example, of the twin studies in London in the 1960s and early 70s, there was a definite understanding then that the prevalence of what they then referred to as mental handicap was really high within the context of people with autism, whereas now that those sort of estimates have changed quite a lot, probably because we're not necessarily learning more about autism, but we're diagnosing autism differently. And so potentially a lot of the people now are people who wouldn't have been diagnosed then. And there's all of these different epidemiological considerations, I suppose, to think about. What, just in that same vein, though, I've written a couple of things down here about what the guy said at the very beginning, that disability is a disability that impairs the sensory input. Is it Dr. Berner? Is that his name, Dr. Berner, at the beginning, the psychiatrist in the place that Rainman was living? I think it's Berner. But anyway, the guy, what he says is that it's a disability that impairs the sensory input and how it's processed, and that Raymond has a communication and learning difficulty. It wasn't far off the mark to how we now begin to talk about autism again. And I think all of that sensory input stuff got lost over a period of time. We fought quite hard to get DSM to push the sensory processing issues well back into the diagnostic criteria, really. And he had that then, he had that quite explicitly. So that was slightly surprising. And I don't remember noticing that before as an issue, but I noticed it this time that I watched it. And then when he mentioned rituals, I just thought it was mildly comical when Charlie Babbitt misunderstood what rituals meant. I think he thought that they meant some kind of bizarre spiritual ritualistic thing. Yes, rituals. He said, yeah. It's like a bit odd. But yeah, he kind of got, I think, nearer to how we now understand autism to be than they understood it to be then. It was quite insightful, really.
That's interesting. They talk about him throughout the film in various times as being high functioning.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your thinking was as well about that, whether that was a correct use of that terminology.
No, I don't think. And I think that goes back to the same issue of the larger proportion, certainly larger than now, larger proportion of people with autism who were intellectually impaired then. And what used to happen, I think, was that people who were able to speak and to speak in more than just sort of single words and communicatively and symbolically were considered to be high functioning. And I think that's what they meant. Now here, I often say on my courses that, what used to happen on the border here between Huntingdon and Cambridge, years and years ago, there was a misunderstanding about the diagnostic criteria. It was a different interpretation, maybe, not even a misunderstanding. But on the Huntingdon-Cambridge border, okay, for Asperger's syndrome, there's a requirement, as many people will know, there's a requirement that there's a higher level of functioning, which has been described in all kinds of different ways. But in the diagnostic criteria, in the previous diagnostic guidelines, DSM-4 versus our now DSM-5, in DSM-4, it said something to the effect that the person must have average cognitive ability. Okay. Now, in Huntingdon, they considered average to mean 100 on an IQ test. In Cambridge, they considered it to mean 70, normal IQ. Okay, 30 IQ points between how things were interpreted at that time. Bit anecdotal of a story, but it absolutely happened. And for years afterwards, within Cambridge, people with Asperger's syndrome were looked after by our learning disability services, which is just absurd. That's not what was intended. But it was a kind of misunderstanding about just that one word, just average IQ, average cognitive ability, whatever. And I think that had come from this whole thing about high functioning, meaning the person can speak. So people in Cambridgeshire with an autism presentation that could speak were considered to be high functioning and considered therefore to have a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome with an IQ of 70. Doesn't work. So it's a big mix-up. And I think it's partly why DSM-5 came in and said, let's just dispense with all of this because we've got terribly confused about what we all mean, and went in the end for autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah, so they've taken out this term Asperger's, which I know has understandably upset many people who have had that label, that definition, and that is how they define themselves. That is an integral part of them. And then they're now told, well, DSM-5 doesn't actually believe that's a thing. Whereas actually I felt, when I saw that I felt it was going in the wrong direction personally, because I still believe that autism is, in all likelihood, describing a lot of different things under one huge umbrella. Yeah. And if we were to take each individual thing out and have a look at it, in a more nuanced fashion, we might actually, 10, 20 years time, realize that actually there's about 3 different types, disorders, whatever it is that you'd like to label them as, that actually
lots.
Yeah. And to then take out one of those that we've already identified just seemed to me to be unhelpful. Although I also do think that one of the problems we've always had is that this term Asperger's as being, again, is a high functioning autism. It's just another term that I've heard people use. Again, really, really unhelpful. Mild autism, again, massively unhelpful, because of course being somebody who has Asperger's isn't mild to them in the slightest.
Absolutely. So, I quite often talk about a woman called Claire Sainsbury, who's very open and a terrific advocate for people with Asperger's syndrome. And Claire came to speak with us in our lab, in Simon Baron-Cohen's lab, a few years ago. She was an engineer student in Cambridge, really high achiever, intellectually brilliant, and heading for a first and all of this. And she has Asperger's syndrome. And what she said at the time was that what was extremely difficult for her was the perception that she had a mild form of autism, because she said, for me, it's anything but mild. She might be intellectually very, very able, but the disabling impact that all of the things with executive function and sensory issues and so on made her life extremely difficult, and she felt that there wasn't particularly much that was mild about her autism. Now, in a sense, I guess that's what DSM-5 is now trying to do. It's trying to push things to have us look functionally at somebody's difficulties and discomforts rather than intellectually. I think that's a move in the right direction. To have people's needs described more in terms of functional day-to-day living rather than how clever you are, and which it used to be a bit more about that. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that it is almost like just when we were beginning to develop these understandings of these different forms of or presentations of autism, they take it all away, and now we've just got one big umbrella term, which difficult.
Do you think then that Rainman as a film was helpful in raising the public awareness of what autism is, or do you think it was a damaging stereotype? How do you sit on that?
I don't go so far as to say it was a damaging stereotype, and I certainly wouldn't say that it was a helpful one either, and that's very much on the fence. But I think it's a little bit like we said at the very beginning of us talking now, that I think it was a spectacularly good account of somebody with autistic savant features. I think that was really, really accurate. But I think that's extremely rare, and that's not autism. So in the sense of that being misinterpreted then, broadly speaking, as representing autism, it wasn't helpful. I wouldn't say it was damaging quite. It led people in a different direction from which they had to be pulled back a little, certainly. It was helpful in raising some awareness. I think that absolutely is the case as well. It's a pity that it was taken at the time. I guess it's inevitable as well. This is the other thing that I was thinking, that this was at a time when people really didn't know about. There were, people I've worked with, medics, who say they'd barely heard of autism until recent years. All the way through their training, all the way through their medical training. So it was helpful in that sense, but I think it misled people as well.
And one of the areas that I think it misled people, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, was with regards to capacity. So at the very end of the film, the psychiatrist, I think he is, appears to assess Raymond's capacity to decide where he lives in the most flippant and horrendous way. And he basically says, stay with Charlie Babbitt or go back to Walbrook, and just repeats those things again and again. And Raymond repeats the same thing. Yes, stay with Charlie Babbitt. Yes, go back to Walbrook. There was no attempt to help him to understand the concept, to understand how to weigh up these two decisions, that these are actually, this is a decision he needs to weigh up in the first place. And he's actually very antagonistic about it. He actually upsets Raymond, and I think somewhat purposely, in an attempt to show Charlie that this person cannot make a decision, which I think is really damaging, because there is no reason to think that Raymond can't make that choice if he were to be helped to make it, or potentially also whether there's the risk that is extrapolated from that if he can't make that choice, then he can't make any choices. Because actually, I don't think that was made very clear, that actually Raymond is an individual who can make choices, who has the right to decide things for himself. And I think that was a message that I think that was very much lost, that could have been...
I think perhaps what it lost, and this is, it might be being a bit too kind to the intention, but I wonder whether they intended to portray this individual as not doing this right, that this will happen, that there are people within institutional life at that time who would do this kind of thing, and we, the filmmakers, know that's wrong. Do you know what I mean? Rather than it being, well, we need to let the population know that a person with autism can't make decisions. I think maybe what they were trying to say is, of course they can, but if you ask them like this, that's what's going to happen. But as I say, that might be being a little bit too kind to the intention that they had. I certainly, interestingly, I thought that the first time I watched it, I thought, oh yes, a bit more refined than this. But I definitely, the first time, many years ago, I had when I first watched it, thought, yeah, it's difficult. It sounds like he wants to do that, but does he really want to do the other thing? This time, and the last few times that I've seen it, I've thought, no, it's just not right. It's hopefully not what would be done. But would it not be done? Really? We know a lot about all of the stuff that's going on with people being moved to various parts of the country to residential contexts that are not very helpful to them and are not really looked at in terms of consent and not really looked at in terms of the choice of the individuals concerned. So one would hope that we're not in the same position. But I don't know. I think that they meant him to be a negative character. I think that guy at the end was meant to be portrayed as somebody that wasn't giving Raymond an opportunity to actually be helped.
Yes, and actually that's possibly then highlighted again when he says, aren't you more comfortable in your Kmart clothes, as you say, as you brought attention to that joke that Raymond then makes. And I think that perhaps, yes, it's about him just assuming that he knows what's best for Raymond because he's known Raymond for so long, as opposed to actually always asking, because our tastes and our opinions and our choices change. And I remember working in residential homes way back early in my career, where through absolutely no fault of their own, there was often an understanding, for example, that a lot of the residents preferred coffee to tea. And this was because they would be asked, do you want tea or coffee? And that's the way that we generally say it, do you want tea or coffee? And everyone would just go coffee, because it was the last word they heard and it would just be repeated. And after a while, it's like, well, we always ask and they always have coffee, therefore we're always going to give them coffee, as opposed to really checking out whether that person is making an informed choice. And of course, it's a much bigger capacity assessment would be required to decide where somebody wants to stay. And the way that we would do those kind of capacity assessments these days as clinical psychologists would be to make sure that the person understands the choices, can weigh those up and communicate what they want. And something which I think is still hard for people to comprehend is that people have the capacity and the right to make bad choices.
Yeah.
And I think that what ends up happening, I think a lot with people who have learning disabilities generally, but also obviously people who have ASD, will have that there is still that tendency where caregivers and very well-meaning people believe that if they're making a bad choice, then they haven't got capacity.
Yeah. And removing the dignity of risk, really, I think. There's a certain dignity in taking risks, isn't there? And I think not being allowed to is it's a hard line, I guess it's a hard line for people who are in care giving capacities, be they parents, family members, people working with individuals with autism. There's a sense, obviously, in which there's a protection motive as well, but there's a very fine line between that and not allowing somebody the dignity of doing daft things, basically,
Yes.
I've certainly done in my life,
Well, exactly. We have the right to do and make terrible decisions because we don't have neurodiversity that is apparent to those around us who believe, therefore, that we need to be looked after. And I think that is it's important to bear that in mind.
Definitely. Absolutely.
So, Dr. Kaz, what was the last film you watched? Or have you got a film in mind that you think that we should analyse again in future?
Oh, gosh. Snowcake, I'd like to. It wasn't the last I watched, and it's a long time since I've seen it. But I couldn't find it to look. I wanted to look at it before today, really, just to potentially add a little bit to the discussion. Couldn't find it anywhere. I think I probably will succeed if I look a bit harder. But yeah, I would like to. I watched The Accountant the other night. That was one of the last films. It was the very last, which I didn't like at all. I said to you in a message, didn't I? It turned into Rambo, which was a bit disappointing. So with these kind of issues in mind, I'm thinking about films that, Snowcake, I would really like to. And one of the reasons, I think, is because Snowcake represents a woman with autism, and that is so often not done. I think, it's interesting when we think about, you mentioned Temple Grandin and talking about the brilliant characters that they've been and are, who present in conference, who present about autism. It is very often women, actually. And that's always kind of intrigued me a little bit, that through all of the prevalence estimates and far more men than women, we're now realising perhaps that there aren't. But through all of that time, it's been the women that have spoken about autism more than men, really. And yet, when we talk about prevalence and, when we get our stereotypes and our lay understanding of autism, it's very often men that are thought about. So I think talking about a woman with autism and a film that portrays a woman with autism would be pretty good.
Absolutely. And I think I mentioned to you Big Bang Theory as being potentially a really good one. But actually, I think a lot of people would therefore assume that we'd be talking about Sheldon as somebody with autism. But actually, I think Amy Farrah Fowler is a much better character to look at, because I think that she has autism, and she's a really prime example of somebody who wants to make friends, who wants to be sociable, but actually doesn't know how, and doesn't know the correct social sort of rules, and they don't make sense to her. So actually, maybe that's our next mission.
That would be an interesting perspective, wouldn't it? Thinking about women with autism portrayed in good.
It's a date.
Thank you. Well, thank you for asking me to do this, because it's been really interesting just kind of preparing a bit for it as well. So great.
You've been listening to Analyse This, Mental Health in Film and TV. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. My guest was Dr. Carol Stott, and we were discussing the film Rainman. Music by Joseph McDade. Post-production editing by David Woods. Visit me at The Dr. Boo on Facebook and Twitter and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your ideas for future episodes and your opinions on the episodes we've already done. Spread the word, tell your friends and colleagues about this podcast, and don't forget to subscribe, like, rate and review. I hope you join us again next time.